Good morning, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming our distinguished speakers on a well coming 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 our distinguished speakers. Good morning, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming our distinguished speakers, Honorable Principal Sir, my dear. Good morning, everyone. It gives me immense
বলুন
pleasure
বলুন
in welcoming our distinguished speakers, Honorable Principal Sir, and my dear colleagues and students, and scholars and teachers to the today national webinar on trauma, pandemics, and cultural discourse, organized jointly by the Department of English, Nagar College, and the Department of English, Nabagram, Amar Kundu College, both situated in the remote villages of Murshidabad in West Bengal. The devastating impact of a pandemic has often derailed the world of its regular momentum. Whether it is the ravages of plague or the terrible 1918 Spanish flu or the 2009 swine flu pandemic, it had all left in its wake a universal memory of terror and trauma. The present global scenario, due to the onslaught of novel coronavirus, has been nothing different. Such traumatic memories have always found its expression in cultural discourse of the time, while the paintings of Bruegel and Bocklin, along with the writings of Chaucer, Gower, Shakespeare, and Goldsmith, made visible the dark reality of the Black Death, Catherine Arnold's eyewitness account, and James Junior Rada's novel laid bare the traumatic memory of the Spanish flu. In the world of cinema, there has been a concerted effort to portray the trauma of a pandemic, particularly in Hollywood movies. In this webinar, we would like to interrogate the myriad ways through which the cultural world engages itself in a complex negotiation with the traumatic memories of pandemics over time. We have virtually assembled here to know more about the topic with the eminent speakers. All are requested to actively participate and put questions in the comment or chat box. We are sure that all will feel enriched with knowledge after completion of this event. We welcome all once again to the webinar and hope that everyone will have a great time ahead. Our heartfelt thanks to everybody. Now I request our respected principal sir to deliver the inaugural speech. Sir, please. Sir, sir, please. You may now start, sir. Sir, am I audible?
স্যার
Sir,
স্যার মাইক্রোফোনটা অফ আছে স্যার আপনার মাইক্রোফোনটা
Thank you, Anwar. A very good morning to all you and welcome this two-day-long national webinar on trauma of pandemic and cultural discourse organized by the English Department, Nagar College in collaboration with Department of English, Nabagram, Amar Kundu College. Now we are all to pass our days through a unique life-threatening situation. Pandemic COVID-19 confines us to our own shelter and stops interface meeting of teachers with the students at educational institution. Under this situation, the endeavor of English department for organizing this national seminar deserves thanks. First of all, I express my gratitude to Dr. M.D. Saifur Islam, teacher in charge, Nabagram, Amarchand Kundu College, for their continued support to organize this national webinar. I would like to thank to organizing secretary Dr. Sudipto Shao, coordinator IKOC Nagar College, joint conveners Abhijit Bhattacharya, assistant professor, head Department of English, Nabagram Amarchand Kundu College, Anwar Hussain, assistant professor and head Department of English, Nagar College, along with all other committee members, as well as Dr. Manik Biswas, assistant professor in Bengali, Nagar College, Tofikur Rahman, office staff, Nagar College, for their relentless effort to organize this program. I would certainly like to welcome Dr. Partho Gangopadhyay, Director, Institute of English, Calcutta, Dr. Mohua Bhaumik, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English, Dirozio College, Kolkata, Dr. Abhishek Parui, Assistant Professor, IIT Madras, and Somnath Chakraborty, Assistant Professor and Teacher in Charge, Lalgola College, for agreeing to be with us as the research persons of this webinar. And last but not the least, I would like to thank and congratulate all the registered and non-registered participants being with us through YouTube channel. I am confident that in this present scenario, the topic of this webinar is very much attractive and it will be added a new dimension by the speakers with their enriched discussion upon the subject matters. I shall end by congratulating all of you once again and wishing you all the best for a successful completion of this today's national webinar seminar. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank, thank you, sir. We are all set now to begin the first technical session of the first day. We are extremely privileged to have with us our first resource person, Dr. Mohua Bhaumik, Associate Professor and Head, Department of English, DOJ Memorial College. She is also guest faculty in the Department of English, West Bengal State University. Her doctoral thesis was on modernism and T.S. Eliot. Her present areas of interest include culture studies, Dalit literature, partition literature, and gender studies. She has published articles in various international journals like Do Goethe, Writers in Conversation, and Les Simple Gadi. Her latest research articles include Surviving in My World, an assertion of Dalit identity, published by SAGE. Recently, Flinders University, Australia has published her interview with Dalit activist and writer Urmila Power. Dr. Bhomik is also a content writer for UGC e-Pathshala. She is going to enlighten us. She is going to enlighten us on pandemic through the lens of literature. All of us, being lovers of literature, are sure to find her speech fascinating and highly absorbing against the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis. We cordially welcome you, ma'am. Ma'am, now over to you. You may start your lecture. Please, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
perfectly
yes,
audible.
ma'am.
Okay.
Thank
A
you.
very good morning to all of you, whoever is present for this webinar, and my heartiest congratulations to both the colleges, particularly the two departments of English who have organized this webinar, namely Nagar College and Nabagram Amorchat Kundu College. My heartiest congratulations to you, particularly because of the topic that you have chosen, which is so very pertinent, so very relevant in the present social context. And being academicians, it is our primary responsibility to carry on with all kinds of academic discourses and engagements, particularly during this period when all the colleges, all the universities and educational institutions are shut down. So I'm really happy and I'm really grateful to you that you have made me a part of this academic journey of yours. So all the very best for all your future and upcoming academic programs that I'm sure you'll be taking up later on. And before beginning, I must say that I was thoroughly moved by the video that you were telecasting just a few minutes back. I don't know who has compiled it, or I don't know whose brainchild it is, but it's so very relevant and it has rightly struck the chord, of this particular webinar. I mean, the background score, the images which had been assembled, it's so very touching, and it has perfectly set the tone for this webinar. Okay, with that note, I would move straight into my presentation today. But for that, I need maybe 2 minutes or so for the setting up of the PowerPoint. And I'm sure both the organizers and the participants will give me that time. Okay. So firstly, all right, just give me 2 minutes. Huh? Okay, is it visible? Is the PowerPoint visible? Hello, organizers. Is the
Yes,
PowerPoint
yes,
visible?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes, yes.
It's coming through?
Yes.
Okay, all right, perfect. Just a minute. Okay, I'm going full screen. So please give me the feedback. Is it perfect?
Yes, clearly visible.
Okay, fantastic. Great. All right. So, we would begin. So as you see that the title of my paper is Pandemic Through the Lens of Literature. Now, what I intend to do through this paper is that I have tried, to locate various examples, various instances of pandemic literature across ages, so that we have a kind of an idea that this monster called pandemic had been there since such a long time in history, and through the reference to various forms of pandemic literature, we are going to have a kind of an idea and a kind of an optimism also that if century after century human beings could survive this kind of epidemic and pandemic, then probably or surely, I won't say probably, surely and certainly we would survive this COVID-19 novel coronavirus also. So that would be my intention, that going through the ages and trying to pick a few instances of this kind of pandemic literature or literature dealing with illness and sickness, and then try to locate that and draw a parallelism with the present social context where we are absolutely devastated by this current form of pandemic, which is COVID-19. So that would be my intention through my paper. So with that note, I would begin my presentation. The pandemic COVID-19 threatens to change our lives in all possible ways and is compelling us to accept the quote-unquote new normal. It seems to be a paradigm-shifting occurrence that puts a line of demarcation between lives and cultures across nations into a before and an after. In this prevailing scenario, humans will emerge transformed, though how those transformations will be manifested is yet to be put in certain terms. The unavoidable and integrally associated images of this outbreak, the different kinds of masks, the countenances of doctors and nurses plastered with care and concern, the closed shops and shopping malls, the unmistakable smell of sanitizers, the deserted look of streets, the sirens of ambulances, the dead bodies wrapped in plastics will haunt our minds and bodies, shaping our memories in our years ahead. As mankind's oldest deadly foe, disease has provided themes to literature since literature's very invention. During this present critical juncture, when the entire society is in a state of despair and worry, the literature associated with the depiction of pandemic can influence the present moment in profound ways, helping us to build connections in those areas where art excels, in emotional landscapes, in particular ways where a past moment impacts the present and offers a much needed and relevant conversation between the harrowing experiences of our bodies and our perception of the world through our reading. Literature offers a crucial role to play in shaping our responses to the pandemic. Ranging from the classics to contemporary novels, the entire range of pandemic literature offers a sense of confidence as how to handle it, provides a sense of comfort, though uncertain, and guides us for what might happen next. The literature of plague, pestilence, and pandemic teaches us to derive some meaning out of the gross and inexplicable experiences of horror, suffering, panic, and frustration. In the midst of the prevailing sense of helplessness and the very absurdity and meaninglessness of human accomplishments, pandemic literature provides us the confidence to move on and to be certain that this is not the only pandemic that humans are suffering from. This very awareness offers us a sense of certitude that life will be worth living again, provides a sense of catharsis, and helps us release our pent-up apprehensions. The ancient world was often threatened with plague and pestilence, and common people had high probability of witnessing the havoc caused by those ailments or listening to detailed, frightful reports about the ruthless ravages caused by those diseases. Plague was such a disease whose spread was literally unstoppable, with practically no medicine to cure the patients and with no preventive measure. The only measure that could be adopted to prevent contracting this disease was to avoid contact with infected persons and contaminated objects. People suffered from an unexplained fright regarding this disease, primarily because it was shaped by a belief about the supernatural origin of pandemic. There was a deep-rooted belief that the disease was the consequence of certain offenses committed against divinity. Such beliefs were strengthened because of biblical references as we find in Exodus, Psalms, Isaiah, and Samuel. As a result, the plague was considered to be God's punishment for sins. In fact, I'll give you one example here, one reference that when the laws were given by God to the Israelites, then God commanded the people to obey those laws or suffer many evils. I quote here, "The Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever and inflammation, which will plague you until you perish." So, during those days, there was a direct contact, there was a direct connection between the sins that the human beings commit and the punishment that is offered by divinity because of those sins committed. So, there was a direct connection between the two. This relationship between plague and sin can also be traced in Greek literature, such as Homer's Iliad and Sophocles' Oedipus the King. Homer's Iliad, as Mary Beard, the Cambridge classicist, begins, with the description of the Greek camp at Troy suffering from plague, which was interpreted to be the punishment imposed upon the Greeks for Agamemnon's enslavement of Chryseis. Daniel Blickman, one US academician, he has argued the drama of Agamemnon and Achilles' quarrel, quote, should not blind us to the role of the plague in setting the tone for what follows, nor, more importantly, in providing an ethical pattern which lies near the heart of the story, unquote. Thus, he suggests that the Iliad offers a narrative of disaster that is the consequence of ill-judged behavior of the characters involved. In Oedipus the King also we can find same sort of reference, like it talks of the of the plague of Thebes, and why is Thebes suffering? We all know that it is because of Oedipus's moral pollution that unknowingly he had committed. So there was a kind of a miasma. We can talk about the miasma later during the question answer session, probably because it has got quite a detailing about it. So we would move on right now to the other references. So till this point, we find that whether it is Bible, whether those were the Greek classics like Iliad or Oedipus Rex, everywhere we found that the concept of sin, the concept of wrongdoing on the part of the human beings, that is integrally related, intrinsically involved with the kind of ailment that the body of that person suffers who has committed the sin, right? Or for that matter, the entire society suffers because of that particular sin that had been committed. However, Greek historian Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, discarded the belief about the supernatural origin of the disease. So we find that gradually the concept of disease is getting transformed. Rather, his focus was on the portrayal of the extreme fear amongst the people regarding the contagious nature of the disease. The awareness that plague did not discriminate between good and evil led to the loss of all social conventions and a rise in selfish interests and relentless good. Thucydides's account is of immense historical interest since it provides us with a clue about the plague of Athens. It was roughly around 430 BC that the plague of Athens took place. The Athenian historian renders his own insights into the epidemiology of the plague. Thucydides deduced that the plague was not the consequence of some malign influence restricted to Athens and its immediate surroundings, which was the analysis as per the Greek medical theory of the contemporary times. Thucydides pointed out that an infected individual might pass on a disease directly to another individual who is yet unaffected. That is, he stressed upon the contagious nature of the disease. So this is very, very crucial, during the course of history, that he was the one, this Greek historian was stressing upon the essentially contagious nature of the disease, and he was saying that there was nothing like good and evil, as far as the disease is concerned. Later medieval writings, such as the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, that is considered as one of the seminal medieval literary publications related to the plague, and it was published in 1353. Now, his protagonists were 7 women and 3 men who had retreated to a villa outside Florence to avoid the pandemic. And when here Decameron, in Decameron, the pandemic has been referred to, the obvious reference is to the bubonic plague or Black Death that ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. Now there in the villa, these protagonists were isolated for 2 weeks, and they used to pass their time by telling stories to each other. Now these stories were sometimes lively, bizarre, and often very filthy kind of stories with a different theme for each day. And these stories were pertaining to morality, sometimes discussing love, sexual politics, trade, and power. The anxious intention of this self-exiled group was that every person born into this world had a natural right to sustain, preserve, and defend his or her own life. Everybody wants to live, so that is something very, very natural. Thus, storytelling becomes its own palliative. It provides a sense of relief to the pain, and it helps them to put deaf ears to the groaning of the ailing persons on the other side of the walls of the villa. In this literary work, storytelling serves as a method of discussing social structures and interactions during the earliest days of the Renaissance. The stories offer both the listeners present within the text, that means all the other people who were listening to the stories when a particular story was being narrated by one particular storyteller, and Boccaccio's readers, that means we, the readers who read Boccaccio now. The stories offer them, both the readers inside the text and outside, the listeners inside the text and the readers outside the text, avenues to explore possibilities through which there is a promise to reconstruct the normal everyday lives which remained dysfunctional during the time of the epidemic. Responses and reactions to the Great Plague of London are the central themes of Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. It is a sustained narrative dealing with details of events, anecdotes, and statistical records pertaining to the Great Plague of London of 1665. Set in 1665 and published in 1722, the novel was likely based in part on the journal of the author's uncle, Henry IV. Defoe, quote, speaks of bodies piling up in mass graves, of sudden death and unlikely recoveries from the brink, and also blames those from elsewhere for the outbreak, unquote. So it is exactly the same situation that we are surviving through now. There is a chronology maintained in the book, though without sections or chapter headings. Defoe takes great pains to bring an effect of verisimilitude, identifying specific neighborhoods, streets, and even houses in which events occurred. Moreover, it provides tables of casualties, and involves discussions on the authenticity of different accounts and anecdotes received by the narrator. There is often a comparison drawn between Defoe's books and the actual contemporary accounts of the plague in the diary of Samuel Pepys. Defoe's account includes much research and is far more systematic and detailed than Pepys's first-person account. The Last Man, written by Mary Shelley, is one of the first apocalyptic novels which depicts a future world ravaged by a global plague. A few persons are portrayed as immune who avoid contact with others. The concept of immunization employed in this book proves that Mary Shelley had a deep understanding about the nature of contagion. The words of The Last Man, I quote, "I have selected a few books. The principal are Homer and Shakespeare, but the libraries of the world are thrown open to me," unquote, offers a sense of relief that even in the finality of the protagonist Lionel Verney's position, there is a way in which words can define our reality, however horrifying that reality is. Her main character is Lionel Verney, as I already said, who had survived the global pandemic in 2073 up to the beginning of the 22nd century and has thus earned the title The Last Man. All of Shelley's characters are substitutes for her friends, like Lord Byron becomes Lord Randolph, her husband Percy becomes Adrian, and so on and so forth. By the time Verney begins his solitary pilgrimage across a desolated world with only the ghosts of Homer and Shakespeare and an alpine sheepdog whom he adopts, he still speaks in a first person addressed to an audience of nobody. I repeat, to an audience of nobody. Unquote. He asserts, thus, the shores of the deserted earth, while the sun is high and the moon waxes or wanes, angels, the spirits of the dead, and the ever-open eye of the Supreme will behold the last man. Thus, in a world devoid of people, Verney gets transformed into the book, as it were, and the inert world turns to be the reader. The Last Man's first-person narration is addressed to a world devoid of people who could actually read it. And apparently, it fails to provide any concrete reason for the existence of language than for mere communication. However, it is needed to construct a world upon the ruins, to bear a witness, even though it is solitary. Language is not only needed to communicate with others, it is very much for our own selves too, and therein lies the importance of literature. Thus, in this novel, literature becomes an affirmation, a kind of rebellion, a medium to prove our existence in the midst of the horrors of pandemic, to assert our conviction that microbes and viruses cannot throttle our voices, even though the bodies may give in. So the bodies may perish, the voices won't. So there lies the importance, the significance of literature. In 1842, the American poet and novelist Edgar Allan Poe published The Masque of the Red Death, a short story in the literary tradition of the plague. Though the personification of the plague represented, through the personification of the plague, represented by a mysterious figure disguised as Red Death, the author ponders over the inevitability of death. Poe's short story delineates the failures of authorities to respond to such a disaster with minimum sensitivity. The Red Death causes fatal bleeding from the pores. In response to this, Prince Prospero gathers 1,000 courtiers into a secluded but luxurious abbey, wails the gates closed, and hosts a masked ball, as if the plague would not be able to enter through the welded gate and identify its prospective victim. Poe details the sumptuous festivities, concluding with the incorporeal arrival of the Red Death as a human-like guest at the ball. The plague personified takes the prince's life and then those of his courtiers. And I quote, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. Unquote. Thus, there is an unfailing criticism of the callousness and inhuman attitude of the authorities towards the disease, which results in complete mishandling of it. The Scarlet Plague, published by Jack London in 1912, is set in a ravaged and wild America. The story takes place in 2073, 60 years after the spread of Red Death, an uncontrollable epidemic that depopulated and nearly destroyed the world in 2013. One of the survivors, James Howard Smith, tells his grandson, so he managed to survive, through the entire scenario of the pandemic. He, after managing to survive, he tells his grandsons how the pandemic spread in the world and about the reactions of the people to contagion and death. London's depiction portrays the same sense of fear and horror as we face during this present pandemic situation of COVID-19. At the same time, London apprehended the end of the world. I quote, "The smoke of the burning filled the heavens, so that the midday was a gloomy twilight, and in the shifts of wind sometimes the sun shone through dimly a dull red orb. Truly, my grandsons, it was like the last days of the end of the world." Unquote. This was the way pandemic was perceived. There was a hysteria, a sense of fear prevailing all around. People were not only scared about their own lives, they had the terrifying notion that it meant the end of the world, the wiping out of human existence. This panic was largely the consequence of the loss of communication with the rest of the world, a hopeless sign of death. I quote, "It was astounding, this loss of communication with the world. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, been blotted out." Unquote. So the importance of communication is so very crucial. It's so very important in these days as well. In October 1918, a delirious Catherine Ann Porter experienced what she herself described as the beatific vision. Being in close proximity to a nearly death-like experience because of the influenza virus, which had taken a toll of 50 to 100 million people, Porter felt transported to a paradisal landscape, a space where one feels liberated from the pain and fear that had overtaken her body. To the utter surprise of everyone, she survived her illness and later reformulated her experience into her novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. The experience, Porter confessed, I quote from the text, simply divided my life. And after I was in some strange way altered, it took me a long time to go out and live in the world again. Unquote. So this talks of the trauma, the after effect of this pandemic. In this novella, Porter focuses on both the physical and emotional jolts of a constantly shifting reality, a reality that is in a state of flux. There is a consistent risk and apprehension of failing to appropriate a new paradigm. So we also do not know how we are going to appropriate the quote unquote new normal, whether we are being able to appropriate it or not. Time would only be able to say. Virginia Woolf, after her encounter with the Spanish flu, that is in 1918, she observes in her essay On Being Ill how illness affects the body and our consciousness. She asserts that literature is always focused on the mind, the soul, the emotions. But in reality, she says, I quote, all day, all night, the body intervenes, unquote. The intense pain, the acute suffering, the profound isolation illness provides shapes our perceptions, unquote. As As Woolf writes, the solitude of the bedroom against the assault of fever has a long-drawn impact. That is exactly what I'm trying to stress on, that the impact, the long-drawn impact, the trauma that is associated with this entire pandemic scenario. So, and we find the references of this particular Spanish flu in other modernist literature also, like the Westland, the Second Coming, where there are the fragmented perceptions, the burning pain of fever and ache, the body's internal delirium, and the hallucinatory realities. William Maxwell's elegiac novel, They Came Like Swallows, takes the readers down the paths of fear and apprehension and makes them witness to a haunting fear that one might be unknowingly responsible for passing a deadly infection to another one. It seems that everyone is suffering from a sense of guilt that a particular action might lead to causing harm to a loved one. No one is absolutely certain about the specific roots of contagion. Hence, their very existence is based on if-then. Like if they had not entered that room, or if they had chosen the next train in place of the earlier train, if they had taken their boy out of school earlier. So the entire world is, surrounded by the if and the then. If I had done this, then probably I would have been able to evade the situation, or probably I would have been able to be successful to make my beloved one, or to keep my family members safe and secured. This kind of mental state is the common lot of every other individual in the present scenario, where one would keep on pondering if he or she would have acted in a particular way, then the crisis could have been averted. In the 20th century, Albert Camus' The Plague and Stephen King's The Stand brought the attention of the readers to the social implications of pandemics. These novels stress on the failures of the state to either contain the disease or control the obvious panic. The concept of self-isolation evokes an awareness of the importance of human relationship in Camus' famous work, which is centered on the inhabitants of an Algerian town of Oran who are stricken by the bubonic plague. It was published in 1940s, but can be very well related with our present social scenario. I quote, "This rustic, clean-cut deprivation and our complete ignorance of what the future held in store had taken us unawares. We were unable to react against the mute appeal of presences still so near and already so far, which haunted us day long." Unquote. The source material chosen for this novel is the cholera epidemic that killed a large proportion of Oran's population in 1849. However, Camus situated the novel in the 1940s. The novel puts emphasis on the abject powerlessness of individual characters to confront the disease and thus to fight against their destinies, and presents a snapshot of life in Oran as seen through the author's essentially absurdist point of view. Here, the disease is an element of abstraction and an unreality in misfortune. The very awareness of the random and arbitrary nature of the disease makes people realize their limited capacity in front of the pandemic as a whole. The Stand is a post-apocalyptic dark fantasy novel written by American author Stephen King and published in 1978. The plot of the novel focuses on a pandemic of a weaponized form of influenza that kills almost the entire world population. A highly contagious and lethal form of influenza is created as a biological weapon in a secret laboratory of the US Department of Defense. It is estimated to be 99.4% fatal. Project Blue, which is a bioengineered superflu, leaks out of an American military base and the pandemic ensues. The complete and uncut edition of the novel contains a prologue which offers a detailed depiction of the development of the virus and the accidental release of it due to certain security issues and security breaches. A handful of survivors, united in groups, establish a new social system and finally engage in confrontation with each other. King recently stated on Twitter that COVID-19 is certainly not as serious as its fictional pandemic, requesting everyone to adopt necessary precautions. Station 11 is a 2014 novel written by Emily St. John Mandel. Mandel chose as the novel's setting the Great Lakes region after a fictional swine flu pandemic known as the Georgia flu devastated the world, killing almost the entire population. After a swine flu pandemic wipes out most of the world's population, a group of musicians and actors travel around newly formed settlements to keep their art alive. Mandel showcases the impact of the pandemic on all of their lives, bringing forward the perspectives of character not only from diverse geographical locations but also from different time frames to show how humanity at large, though scattered, though fallen apart, has the potential to come back together. Herein rests the importance of art and literature that helps us to move on, keeping our hopes alive that no matter how trying the times are, life will exist. The novel Fever, written by South African author Dion Meyer, provides a detailed depiction of the apocalyptic consequence of a weaponized bioengineered virus that prompts survivors to besiege one another for resources. It is the story of the survival of a father and son in a desolated South Africa after the virus obliterated 95% of the world's population. Meyer wished the deadly virus that wreaked havoc in his 2016 thriller Fever had not turned into an uncanny resemblance of the coronavirus pandemic ravaging the entire world today. Meyer said, I quote, I find no pleasure in it. I keep thinking of the sorrow of all those thousands of people who have lost their loved ones, lost their jobs, and are living in fear, unquote. Susan Sontag, an American writer, points out in Illness as Metaphor that, I quote, illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. Unquote. Pandemic brings a strange equality and does not spare anyone, neither a pauper nor a king, and makes us ponder about the so-called socio-economic stratifications prevalent in the society. The impact of this experience is long drawn and the erasure of this memory is not possible. But both the body and the mind are scarred and it would take a long time to heal these wounds. In this state of hopelessness, when life becomes futile, pandemic literature offers us a scope to narrate stories, which is a reminder that sense still exists somewhere. If the outside world seems filled with despair and bleakness, then at least there is meaning within our invented stories. Literature gives us the courage to reclaim this world, the world which is beset with ailment, suffering, and trauma. The spirit to reclaim is much needed during this time of crisis because that is the way humans can win over this demon called pandemic. Narratives can preserve and remake the world as it falls apart. Such is the point of telling any story. Illness reminds us that the world does not belong to us. Literature tells us that it does. Thank you.
Greetings to one and all. I'm Srija Konar, Assistant Professor in English, Nagar College, Murshidabad. I'm elated to wish and grace all the participants' virtual presence in this webinar. And we are grateful for the time and effort Dr. Bhumi took to share her thoughts with us. And she has amazingly traversed the entire journey of literature and pandemic that goes side by side from the time of Homer to Stephen King. And she has addressed adroitly some key points which intrigues us, and it tempts us to ask some questions regarding that. And there are some questions which are popping in our screen also that would make this webinar more engaging and interactive. I would like to convey those questions to our dear speaker, Dr. Bhomik. Okay, so some of the questions which I find interesting during the webinar is that we find cholera outbreak in Oran in Camus' novel The Plague. Has today's China's Wuhan turned out to be new Oran? For us, what's your view on it? Please share with us.
Yeah, actually, there are not only we talk about Camus' plague, but there are so many other examples also. In fact, if you have gone through Severance, then you would find that
Yes.
talks about the virus that was manufactured in China itself. So yes, of course, there are uncanny resemblances. I'm talking about Ling Ma's novel. If you go through Ling Ma's novel, you would find that she's a American Chinese author, and there she talks about China itself, right? And that fictional fungal infection originated in Shenzhen, which is a part of China. So yes, the resemblances are uncanny. Those are eerie, and we ponder that how things are possible in this way. Is there some kind of grand design, or I mean, it's so eerie and so uncanny that yes, there are striking resemblances, and that is exactly what Stephen King was trying to, and there was some kind of guilt in Stephen King, and that is why he tweeted that no, we can definitely survive this pandemic, and though it has striking resemblances with mine, but the intensity differs. And exactly so, you are so correct that Camus' novel and the portrayal, the depiction, of the pandemic that was there in Oran, and Oran didn't suffer the pandemic for a single time. There are multiple times that Oran had been absolutely destroyed, by this kind of pandemic. So yes, the resemblances are definitely very, very striking, and they're very eerie and uncanny. Of course. No denial to that.
Another important side of your lecture titillates me to comment on this, that if you find this war and pandemic goes side by side,
hand in hand,
from the time of Greek, as you have mentioned. I am really pleased that you have mentioned Thucydides as the Peloponnesian War, and also Homer's Iliad, which starts with war and plague, as if the Western literature starts with plague and pandemic and
yes,
with destruction. And
yes. And
the influenza plague at the time of World War, and also and we see in Camus the Algerian war with France. So these kinds of war and plague always go side by side, and both of these events, plague and war, take us by surprise. We are surprised, and we do not know what to do with these kinds of situations. And
yes, in
both
fact,
plague and war are traumatic. So
yes, of course, and
yes,
in fact,
please.
if you take the time of modernism, right, there when Eliot is talking about the First World War, right, the ravages that those were there during the World War, there are palpable elements of the Spanish flu which was there. And when Eliot is talking about he who was living is now dead, and then he's saying, I had not thought that date had undone so many, quote unquote. So the reference is to the World War, and the reference is also to this particular the disease, the pandemic which was there. And if you go to the biographical details, you would find that both Eliot and his wife Vivian, they had suffered from this particular Spanish flu, and probably it was, if I'm not mistaken, December 1918 that they suffered, and Vivian's suffering was much more acute. So they had gone through, you if you take the example of Yeats's wife was suffering at that point of time when the Second Coming was getting published, when he was composing it. So these are all so very integrally associated, and we cannot segregate them. Those are all combined together, the impacts, right?
And in this literature, which are based on plague, we can find that it's amusing that there are many female writers, are Catherine Ann Porter, Susan Sontag,
Yes.
and Virginia Woolf, and so these are amazing that we can find
Canadian
female
writer,
writers
Mandel.
on this also. Yes. And as I have gone through your biodata that your doctoral thesis is on modernism. So nowadays, people are hankering after these modern authors. And a recent book has published in April 2020 by Elizabeth Autka on viral modernism, which indicates that how pandemic seeps into literature.
Right.
And this book is now out of market. So this kind of literature, as we can discuss that, we know Defoe's other works, but we are not very much interested in Plague of the Year. But in these situations, we are all interested in this kind of
earlier
literature.
people hardly read this form of literature.
Yes.
See, everything has got a positive side. So now we are looking so much into it. We are trying to reread the multiple interpretations. Those can be,
Which are being
from
foretold.
kind of literature. Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Which are being foretold, and we are
Otherwise,
trying
before
to.
the pandemic, you tell me how many
Yes.
seminars were there based on pandemic. I mean, this area was
Yes.
completely unexplored, except a few scholars.
But people had written on it much before.
Of course,
And
of course.
yes,
Like if you take, for
and
example, Virginia Woolf. So
yes,
she had written about it. So there were writings, quite extensively on this.
Yes, and we know Sontag for photography, not for illness as metaphor.
Absolutely,
So-
absolutely.
And there's another interesting question that why did influenza pandemic of 1918 and 19 erase from the historical and cultural memory of entire Europe? Is it for the World War or anything else?
Yes. There cannot be. I mean, if you talk of memory, then the forgetting associated with memory, that has multiple layers associated. I mean, there are many memories, like say for example the partition history, the trauma, the kind of horror that women were associated with during the partition. I mean, there are many erasures of history which have which have got different politics associated with them, right? Erasure of memory is a very, very very intrinsic and very sensitive kind of area, right? Memory literature, when we talk of that. But as far as this particular question is concerned, the erasure of memory was not there, but definitely since the First World War was so panoramic, its effect was so comprehensive that people talked more about the after effect of the First World War than the illness that was there at that point of time. So the erasure was not there, but definitely the First World War came to the limelight because of the panorama of devastation, the panorama of futility and anarchy, as Eliot had put it, that it was the panorama of futility, it was the panorama of anarchy. So because of that came to the forefront. But definitely the very fact, the very historical truth that the pandemic was there, that we know that was not erased because of the literature, because of so many references that we get from the literature of that particular period, right?
Thank you, ma'am, for your detailed answer. And there's another question that what about post-traumatic growth? Will the journaling, will the storytelling would help us in this way to form our mental space, mental scape to bear this pandemic? What is the post-traumatic growth?
Yes. Yes, you want to add something, Srija? Or should I answer?
As we are become stories. So our stories, and we also transforming ourselves into stories.
Right.
So what about that?
There are two ways to look at it. Firstly, if we may, I mean, when we talk of we mean the writers of this particular time. When the writers are writing, then those are the stories which will be placed in the entire narrative of history. And at the same time, hello Partho. Okay, so and at the same time, we ourselves would be stories, right? So there are two ways to perceive it. One is that the stories would be written by the writers, which would be there as the narratives of history, as the narratives of this particular time, the socio-cultural construct that would be there. And at the same time, we would be stories ourselves, which the future generation would be reading into, right? So there are two ways to look at it.
Okay, and another question, it's the last one, that what's the ontological and epistemological way of addressing plague, and how it is it related to our existence? If you please answer it.
Yes, you see, plague, as I say, that plague had been there since time immemorial, right? And when we talk of the Bible, there are so many examples where it's said, the delineation is such that it seems as if the omnipotent is there, the divinity is there to punish you with plague if you commit something wrong, if you commit a sin. So from there onwards, till the time of Shakespeare also, we find that, in fact, when Shakespeare was born, I mean, the entire England was being ravaged by plague at that point of time. And in fact, there are so many references. Shakespeare did not write about the plague, as it were, I mean, directly, but there are definitely many references, like as we find in King Lear. So it's a sick world, the very delineation, the portrayal is of the sick world. And he says that thou art a boil, a plague sore in my corrupted blood. So you see, the very concept of plague had been there since probably the beginning of the Greek classics, and even before that, during the times of the Bible also. But we have crossed that, that phase, that time period. And now there are the different other kinds of pandemics which are there, and we see about the fictional pandemics also, the bioengineered pandemics which are there. So yes, from the plague till this time, it's a long journey, but everywhere we find the references of pandemics, and we have moved on.
Thank you, ma'am, for your insightful thoughts that you have shared with us. And at last, but not the least, I want to recount. Yes.
Hello, Srija. Actually, there are a few more questions in the comment box. If you allow me, I can just go through them.
Okay, you can. Yes. Yes, Obijita, you can raise them to Mohuadi.
Okay, Mohuadi, I guess there are a few questions lined up, so it's already an extended session.
The voice is breaking now.
Hello, am I audible now? Am I audible? Hello?
Very faintly, because your voice is breaking. Yes, Obijit, please carry on.
Hello. Am I audible, Mohuadi? Is it? Hello?
Yes, carry on, please. Yeah, partially audible, because it's getting broken.
Yeah, there is a question. Yeah, there's a question. The question has been asked by Anushua Chatterjee. Her question is it too far-fetched to conjecture that the narrative of divine punishment during the epidemic situations was part of a panopticon approach to impose discipline?
Yes, why not? Because there was the continuous kind of warning. Yeah, should I answer?
Yeah.
I got your question. Yeah, okay, all right. So you see, during the time of the Bibles, and also later on also, this concept of disciplining people by projecting the kind of relationship that is there between committing wrong and the disease that you would be suffering from. Yes, definitely that sense of discipline is there, because when we talk of the Egyptians, we find that God had been punishing them because of their immoral ways of life. And then there were the warnings given to the Israelites that you need to follow the path of the right and you shouldn't be committing any kind of sin, so that you are not punished by divinity. So definitely it was one of the ways by which the society could be disciplined. That framework was always there. And if you talk of Oedipus, say for example, then also we find that there was the concept of this miasma. The miasma refers to the god's punishment, or the moral corruption, or the religious anomalies those were there. So if you are doing something wrong, then not only you but your entire community will be punished. And that is exactly the way Oedipus Rex had projected the plague of Thebes, right? The entire Thebes was ailing because of the unconscious wrongdoing on the part of Oedipus. So yes, definitely discipline was at the back of the mind. Probably the concept of disciplining the entire society was there, with this with this kind of connection that was built between sickness and the concept of sin.
There's another question by the same person. This goes like, can pandemic literature be considered as the micro narratives of history to counter the grand narratives?
Yes, because you see, as I was saying earlier, that pandemic literature is something which was hardly, read by people at large. I'm not talking about the research scholars or the critics, but overall, as we talk of the larger readership, then definitely those were not in the canon, right? I mean, if we talk of canonical literature, or if we talk of the grand narratives, then of course those were not there. Those were, a few of them were bestsellers, and that is it. All right. But now, during this kind of socio-cultural milieu, the scenario that we are in now, so of course, these would be there as commentaries, and this would be reread, and I'm sure this would be, the possible areas to explore, through which the history of pandemic can be created. And that is exactly what I myself was trying to do, going through the ages and taking examples of pandemic literature from various ages, and trying to locate our own way of reading into it, and trying to build a kind of a relationship, trying to create a kind of a framework in which we can place ourselves in context of pandemic literature. So yes, of course, that would be a commentary, a huge commentary, and a very valuable commentary, for that matter, in the in the scale of grand narrative, in the context of grand narrative. So that would be a huge
as
area
ma'am has also mentioned not only the novels but also an essay by Woolf
short stories.
on
Yes,
being
exactly.
ill.
The short stories,
Yes.
the essays, everywhere you find the
Yes.
reflection. So as I said, that
The Masque
this
of the
would
Red,
be a
and
very,
post the Masque
very,
of the Red.
important area, very significant area to explore and research, from where we can get so many ideas about the next course that we might adopt as how to survive this. And it would be, it has a cathartic impact on our psyche also.
Yes, which
Thank you,
enlighten
Mother.
us
Thank
that
you,
not
Adi.
only not only
Yeah, you
fiction
could
but
continue.
non-fiction she has
Thank you.
Yes,
included.
of course, absolutely.
I
Right. Yes.
Yes, I think this session is going to be interactive far more than we have thought, for ma'am's patience, and she is
Yes,
bearing
there are
with
too many
so many
questions, and I'm
questions.
very happy that I can answer them. Right.
Yes,
I mean, it
she
becomes
is
interesting
being
when you
flooded with questions, and we should win this up for the next speaker. We should spare this now. And at the end, last but not the least, I want to recount one quote from. It just sparks my mind. I want to recount one quote from Camus, that all a man could win in the conflict between plague and life was knowledge and memories. And I think from Dr. Bhaumik's lecture, we have gained both knowledge and lovable memories. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being with us. Our next
thank
speaker
you so
is
much. It
Partha
was a delight
Gangabadhai,
being here.
who
Thank you,
our
Srija
next
Konar.
speaker. Okay, sir. It's over to you. Okay.
Thank you, Srija Konar, and thank you, Obhijit Bhattacharya, and thank you, Didi, for your thought-provoking lecture, tracing
My
the
pleasure.
whole history of pandemics from ancient times till date, with reference to world literature, and setting the tone for the webinar. We may now proceed to the second technical session of the day. We are extremely delighted to have with us Dr. Partha Gangopadhyay, Director of the Institute of English, Calcutta. He is also a visiting faculty in the Department of English, West Bengal State University. Previously, he taught at various esteemed institutions like Krishnanagar Government College and Sanskrit College. His areas of specialization include British Bengal interface, Rabindranath, and modern age. Dr. Gangopadhyay is going to talk on pandemic and social change, past and present. This is a topic in which we should all be deeply interested, particularly in the present COVID-19 situation, which has brought about a pandemic paradigm shift. A warm welcome to Dr. Gangopadhyay, who has been my friend, philosopher, and guide since I was in school. Everyone of us is eagerly waiting to listen to your lecture. Sir, over to you. Sir, please.
Sound. Okay. It has been unmuted. So long I was, the administration, I think, had muted, so I could not speak. Thank you, Anwar. Now, before I start, I would just like to get a few information about this. Students in the audience? Are the students of the college in the audience?
Hello. Hello.
Yes,
Yeah, there are students as well as research scholars and professors and people from different fields, I guess.
Yeah.
There have been more than 600 registrations, and we're having a huge footfall.
Actually, I'm more interested with the students because I'm not as learned as you are. So I don't know whether I would be giving anything which would be a food for thought for the more scholarly people. But yes, I mean, since my love is always the students, so I would be primarily addressing the students in this lecture. One more thing that since I was not in the previous session, could you, in a one-liner, just summarize what Moha said? Because if there are repetitions in my lecture, then I might avoid those areas. I just don't want to repeat if anything has been already said.
Actually, Mohadi, what she did was she was trying to give us a brief review of the types of literatures that was written on pandemics over the years, starting from the Greek age.
Just excuse me a moment. I have an important phone call. I'll just.
Yeah. Take it, please.
হ্যাঁ, মাম এখন ভালো আছে, মোটামুটি কোনো অসুস্থতা নেই, তবে ব্লাডটা তো
Actually, sir's wife is suffering from corona, and she's corona positive, and therefore sir has to receive this important call.
He has been extremely kind enough to still be here with us.
To manage everything and his with us. So please bear with us.
Critical monitors. আমি তোমায় একটু পরে ফোন করি, আমি একটা লেকচার দিচ্ছি। Yeah, extremely sorry.
No issues.
Actually,
It's okay.
This is a very emergency situation. One of my senior colleagues is admitted at Apollo Hospital with COVID-19, and he is in quite a serious condition. So these are the times we are living in, a very difficult time.
No,
anyway,
it's a
yeah. So I'm starting. Actually, where I want to place this entire COVID-19 debate is to see if there are certain prominent suggestions about some changes that might occur in the society because of a pandemic, a global pandemic experience. Now that is my major premise. But then at the same time, we are not fortune tellers that we can actually predict future in a very definite way, but only taking certain lessons from the past, only from studying the past. If we could guess about how this entire COVID-19 episode is playing itself, and how, if there are any possible changes that might come over in the world order, in the social system, in the relationships, in morality, ethics, and all these areas, because of this rare experience. Yeah, today we are definitely coming to terms, slowly and gradually we are coming to terms with this COVID-19 pandemic, which is associated with a severe acute respiratory syndrome because of this coronavirus, and we call it SARS-CoV-2. But we have to remember that this is not the only pandemic that the world has seen, and moreover, there have been more severe pandemics in the world throughout history, throughout the time that man has recorded history. There have been pandemics, and these pandemics have been of far greater impact and stature than the COVID-19 that we are facing. And definitely, these events have taken some. These events, these great events, have actually had major role to play in, if not bringing about, at least an instrumental role in expediting social change in the past. We could name several. I mean, for example, when Peloponnesian War was being waged between Athens and Sparta, Athens was under an epidemic condition, and because of that, Athens actually lost the war, and Sparta ultimately gained supremacy over the Greek civilization. This could, again, I could take from history another epidemic, for example, the Justinian plague, which happened actually in Constantinople. It might have originated in Egypt, but then it played a havoc in Palestine and in Constantinople, and this actually prevented Emperor Justin from bringing together the two flanks of the Roman Empire, the eastern and the western flank. So that enterprise which Justinian was engaged in to reunite Roman Empire once again, that suffered because of that pandemic which took place in Constantinople, in eastern part of the Roman Empire, about 500 BC. Yeah, that about. I mean, that's the timer. I don't remember. I can't recollect the exact dates. But that's not my major area of concern. I'm not going to make any kind of historical chronicling, because again, I mean, that reminds me of the fact that chronicles of the plague are numerous. When we talk about plague, well, the person who comes to my mind, the name that comes to my mind first is Boccaccio and Decameron, because we know that the stories of Decameron are being told when Boccaccio is actually escaping his city because of a plague is ravaging the town. And again, Giovanni Sarcambi happened to be one of those sources of William Shakespeare's stories, William Shakespeare's plays. And Giovanni Sarcambi also has chronicles on plague. And so there are several chronicles about plague that occurred in Europe several times over the entire medieval age. And actually the plague stopped its havoc about 18th century. So till 18th century, plague was something which is, where the intensity of it definitely reduced over a period of time. But plague was something which had troubled Europe time and again. 1665, the Great London Plague. So we have a lot of plagues happening. I mean, medieval times it's an age of pestilence. So, and these pestilence, these plagues that ravaged Europe throughout the Middle Ages had a major role to play in actually bringing about a collapse of the social order which was prevalent in the medieval age, that is the feudal social order, and it played an influential, fundamental role in bringing about what we call the modern age, the modern modes of production, the agrarian capitalist mode of production, which later on, through industrial revolution, developed into what we have the present day to the financial capital mode of production. So I'm actually going to talk about this entire thing, that how the Black Death, the plague that ravaged the Middle Ages, the medieval age, from about 1347 to 1351, how that was how that played a very instrumental role in bringing about a great social change. A great social change means not only a social change, but actually a collapse of one kind of a social order and beginning of another social order. So it was a watershed kind of an event that happened about 17th century, when we have a shift from the feudal modes of production to capitalist mode of production. So that is going to be my overall argument. Again, there are certain warnings that I have to initially put before we can go into the argument. Why do we always talk about only pestilence? Any event which is as dramatic as a pandemic, which is as widely prevalent as a pandemic, all these events have some capacity or a large capacity. That is something which depends on the other social factors, other economic and political factors. But then all these events which have such expanse, such wide prevalence, all of these have some kind of role to play in changing society. Be the revolutions that have taken place in the world, be the wars, Second World War primarily, because Second World War is actually that event that actually brought about a new social order, new world order, new geopolitical world order, where we have end of colonialism and beginning of imperialism, to say proper. We can talk about the revolutions that took place, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Cultural Revolution in China, and all these brought about a social change. So any event which affects such a large number of people at one point of time, they all have the capacity of changing social order, and pandemics are definitely so. Coronavirus pandemic, the kind of COVID-19 pandemic that we are talking about and we are extremely worried about, well, it has not yet reached that kind of expanse, that kind of mortality, that kind of severity, which can make it a suitable candidate for bringing about such an immense social change. But yes, definitely by looking at the pandemics that have visited the world, parts of the world earlier, and comparing with what the events that are happening today, we can at least get some kind of an idea about what we can expect and what our duties to be done, what should be done, so that we can prevent undesirable changes. But yes, we should be also playing instrumental role in bringing about those welcome changes. If the pandemic gives us an opportunity of bringing about a welcome change, so why not? So that, in that sense, COVID-19 should be an opportunity and not something which we should only be traumatized about, or which should only be troubled about. We should take the opportunity. If there are any possibility of a major change that can be brought with this, brought because of this pandemic, then so be it. I mean, that is actually planning for a world which is a better one than it is at present. So I'm going to be arguing within these parameters that I have laid down. Now, the first thing that I would like to categorically express is that epidemics, if more than anything else, not only are they some kind of a rupture in the existing social order, but they also are somehow a mirror to our human nature. It is almost a mirror to a human nature, any epidemic, in the sense that our faith in, or our belief in certain relationships, our belief in a set of political, ecclesiastical, moral order, code of conduct, our faith in whatever the knowledge system, the epistemology, ontology of that period, be it science, be it religion, whatever it be, all these are actually shown back to us. These are those times where we actually look our image, look into our mirror image and ask, what has gone wrong? What has been the real nature of our belief system, of our morality, of our ethics, of our social order, of our political leaders and political order, and all these. Not only that, these epidemics, whether we take the example of the Black Death in the medieval age or be it the COVID-19, they also bring into prominence, almost focus, like those well-lighted makeup mirrors that are there when we apply makeup before appearing on stage. They actually show those chinks and those fault lines in our society. These times, these troubled times of pandemics, also somehow break open those very thin lines of divisions, those thin lines of polarization that were there, but we could not recognize. But these times are such when those chinks, those gaps are wide open for us to see. So all these do play when such an event of such a massive scale is taking place all over the world. I will concentrate my arguments to one particular epidemic, to one particular pandemic, that is the Black Death, which happened in Europe, definitely in England. England and France were affected greatly by it. And that was the Black Death tragedy, or Black Death Plague, as we call it, from 1347 to 1351, about. To quickly get to the timeline of this Black Death Plague, in 1347, the arrival of the Black Death to Crimea was chronicled. And we know that medieval times are the times of chroniclers, and everywhere chronicles are being written. And the pestilence first comes to Crimea. The following winter, it was spread to Genovese. Actually, it was spread by Genovese. I will come to this. I will come to the details of this event of Genovese traders to Constantinople and then to Italy. In 1348, it had reached the Western Mediterranean, and by the summer heat, we have the entire Western Europe, France, Germany, England, and all of these countries. They are being affected by this plague. In 1349, this plague reached Northern Europe, and in 1350, Scandinavia and Russia. And this plague continued till 1720, although with reduced intensity, and the gap between each period was extending day by day. But then till 1720, this plague continued. It was quite a long time, 400 years about, when this plague spread all over Europe, and plague has become almost a common word in European history, European culture, because of this experience. However, as we progress in time, the plague outbreaks were not as virulent as it happened during the Middle Ages, and obviously the kind of change that were triggered by the 1347 to 1351 period, that never happened elsewhere or any other time in history. The plague had a terrible impact, terrible impact. I mean, again, when I say a terrible impact, well, I'm actually keeping in mind the mortality, the number of people who died. But if we look at from a distance, now the distance is about 700 years. Well, I don't think the plague was that a terrible event at all, because plague was instrumental in bringing about certain very positive changes. So when we talk about the plague being a very terrible event, we are actually keeping in mind the mortality, the number of people who died in this plague, but then the part of population that was actually wiped out. That is something which is coming to my mind when I use the word terrible. But then it is not always that the effect was terrible in the larger sense of the term. History, in the time frame of history as a whole, we know 700 years, 400 years, 500 years is a minuscule time. Any sort of change takes place through a long period of time, and when we look at history in a wider expanse, such short 500, 700 periods of time appear to be minuscule. So when we judge history, we always judge by the consequences, the larger consequences that took place of these events. In that sense, plague did bring about some very positive changes in ultimate analysis. The plague had a terrible impact. It is estimated that all over Europe, about a quarter of the population was wiped out, and in some places, the population that was wiped out, that was annihilated, was even more than 50%. This is recorded. And what is good about this? Why it is so safe to talk about Black Death plague or this tragedy is that there is enough documentation. There is enough documentation in paintings, in chronicles, in contemporary accounts. There are enough evidence, chronicles. These chronicles were not only kept by the churches, who were actually the custodian of chronicles. Even there are chronicles which are half finished because one who was actually chronicling died somewhere in the middle because of plague and could not further go on. So we have a lot of evidence of what happened in this period. And so, as for a historian, it is always easy to talk about when we talk about the great this Black Death plague because of the documentation itself. And we can also make certain concrete analysis because of these very solid historical documents that we have of this plague. The direct impact of this plague was on the economy, which was basically reduction in production as well as in consumption. Now, this is something which is a parallel to the present day. So, when I'm analyzing the Black Death, I would not be, because when I was preparing this paper, I was always thinking about this fact that when I'm talking about Black Death, am I actually allegorically talking about the present time? So, I would not be commenting much on the present times because we don't know what is going to happen. We are not fortune tellers, and that is not something which any academician should do. What is going to happen? I mean, we are not those doomsday, fortune tellers or prophets of the apocalypse that we can actually talk about what is going to happen after this entire COVID-19 experience. I'm not going into that. I will never go into those kind of predictions. But at the same time, when I was reading and preparing for this entire journey for about an hour that I'll be here, I was actually always thinking about the fact that am I actually allegorically talking about COVID-19? Let's see if I can make myself clear. The direct impact on economy and society of this plague, especially in England, was basically a reduction in production and consumption due to scarcity of labor. Now, this is something which we don't know even to this day whether COVID-19 will bring about. The epidemic clearly caused economic effects, which brought about a deep recession. Although the epidemic was not the only reason for this recession, there were many other factors. Yes, the epidemic also contributed to it, but definitely there were many other factors. The most noteworthy economic consequences of the disease were that the fields were not cultivated and the harvests rotted. This in turn sparked incipient shortage of agricultural products, which were only consumed by those people who could pay for them. Now, is it not very parallel? Is it not a parallel to this day when there is shortage? If we take the example of India, where our poor people have to go with the poor quality of rice that is being distributed through our very shoddy PDS system. And there are people who are actually multiplying their wealth manifold times, myriad times, and they are, well, enjoying a very comfortable life. So that is something which happened during the Black Death as well. Because of this increase in price, definitely what happened was good food, luxury, extravagance, comfortable life was affordable by only a few, whereas those with humble means endured hardship and suffering. I think we have parallels. Well, it is not that medieval people in Europe were unaccustomed to suffering. Suffering was something which was part and parcel of the poor people of the Middle Ages. The reason was basically the semi-servility. It is not that it was a slave society where the poor people were under some kind of a bonded labor of the rich, but this was no better than servility at all. I mean, it was almost a little better maybe than the slave society where that is it. I mean, the serfs were not slaves in the proper sense of the term, but no better as well, because they were bound to the law by certain socioeconomic factors. The people of medieval Europe were not unaccustomed to suffering, but this was unprecedented. This plague, death would come within days, even hours of the showing symptoms. Because I mean, the plague happened. We have those ring of roses, pocket full of poses. Actually, not poses. Pocket full of pusses. Actually, so there would be boils, and the boils would be filled with pus, and then very soon the person would die. So no sign in the morning. But the symptoms occur because of no medical aid, because of very poor sanitation. There would be no care taking place, and the person would die within hours. That was the basic trajectory of this disease. I mean, it is horrible. I mean, when we read the accounts of how these plagues happened, there are even paintings by Sir Camby when he's illustrating his novella. He's using his chronicles, Sir Camby. He's using certain paintings, certain sketches. So these are now that they are very widely available on the net for everyone to see. Death would come within days and even hours of showing the symptoms, and who fell ill, the mortality was probably upwards of 60%. So when we talk about excuse me, when we talk about COVID-19, the mortality is somewhere about 1 to 2%, but then the mortality rate of Black Death was about 60%. Panic definitely spreads even further, as it's happening even today, and most sacred bonds of the society begin to snap. We have examples. Medieval chroniclers have given examples of priests abandoning their flock. They are the first to run away. There are parents who are abandoning their children. Husbands are abandoning wives, and vice versa. And all this to escape the contagion. So those relationships, those bonds we thought were sacred, they were inviolate. When it came to threat of life, these bonds were snapped within hours, and what mental trauma, what psychological effect these had on the people, though we don't have records, but well, it is easy for all of us to understand. And then there was obviously that same old disease which even today plagues us, of blaming a community for all these pestilence. And the Jewish community was the best target, and the entire blame was initially given to the Jewish communities, who were viciously attacked because they were considered to be the reason for this pestilence. And what kind of treatment the Jewish community got during medieval age is something which we can have a very, very glaring glimpse of it, a very glaring picture of it from the kind of treatment that Antonio did of Shylock in Merchant of Venice. So Shakespeare was somewhere extremely graphic in showing that a Christian could even dare to spit on the gabardine of a Jew if he wanted. So that was the kind of treatment that was given to Jews in Europe during normal times, and during a pestilence. You can imagine to what extent, to what degree the torture of Jews could have gone up, because they were the ones who were considered responsible for the disease. So as it happens everywhere in the world, whether it be America, whether it be India, no differences, because we are always blaming some community or the other for the spread, super spreaders of this disease. But what often goes missing in this entire story of trauma, and this is something which I want to address, the wider story, but actually goes missing in this entire story of trauma, of suffering, of mortality, of death and disease and everything, is the wider context, the wider impact of the Black Death. The story is not simply that of an unfathomable tragedy, but also of transformation and ultimately rebirth. The plague, in combination with a host of other related and overlapping crises, delivered a death blow to medieval Europe, to its feudal social order, and ushered in the new age, which we call modernity, where some of us are in a habit of calling it Renaissance, but I would always prefer the term birth of modernity. And the modern means of production, which is not perfect, but definitely better than the feudal means of production, that is agrarian capitalism. And the ultimate setting, ultimately, this entire agrarian capitalism set the stage for the Industrial Revolution, which was to follow in another 200 years, and the modern world order, the new world order. And this is the calamitous effect of 14th century Black Death tragedy, Black Death plague. Well, it's not always a tragic one, but definitely it also paved the way to progress in the world. If we look about what was Europe before this Middle Ages came in, from about 1000 AD, Europe was on a steady graph of progress and productivity. From about 1000 AD, the population of Europe doubled, and in some places, in fact, trebled. It increased phenomenally. And how could it be possible? It would be possible only because there was enough food, there was enough the good climate, and the other factors. So the European economy grew very fast from about 1080 to about say 1300. So this 300 years is quite a productive time for Europe. There were towns, universities, cities were emerging, and not only that, the great cathedrals were being built, the Gothic cathedrals from which Europe gets its identity. Whenever we talk about Europe, whenever we think of Europe, we always think of the Big Ben and the Westminster Abbey or the Notre Dame Cathedral and all these structures which were identified with European culture, the Gothic culture. Well, very soon, by the end of the 12th century, by a bit of the 13th century, where Europe could boast of these cathedrals which were taller than the pyramids of Giza, which were great monuments of an earlier period. But behind this facade of development, there were also the seeds of destruction of this entire feudal system. Though the feudal system was definitely showing a great progress. It was showing a great political and economic progress. But within this system, there were seeds. There were already seeds were being sown of its own destruction. And what the plague did was actually expedite the process. There were all warning signals, warning signs that the social and economic prosperity of medieval Europe was not on a very solid foundation. Because as the population increased, a large amount of land, which was earlier wilderness, forests, woods, they were cleared for cultivation because there was always constant need for increased food production. And as a matter of fact, because of these reasons, land became a very premium item. It became costly. Land became very costly. So, and when you overtill a land, you know that there is a law of diminishing returns. I mean, the productivity will always reduce with time, and therefore there was always this hankering for more and more land. And to the extent that by the time that we come to about 1250, in fact, whatever land in Europe which could be agreeable, which could be farmed, which could be cultivated, that was already being farmed, that was already under the scope of agriculture. But the labor increased. So on the one hand, the price of land was increasing, and the wages that the labor was getting out of their work was diminishing, was slowly and gradually coming down. And it is this land relationship. It is this land relationship where land is becoming costlier and the labor is in extra. It is in surplus. That we have a problem where the labor is very tightly tied to the law, to the manorial law, the manorial system. I'll come to it now. This is why. So there were people, a large section, the majority of the population were poor, who did not get a decent wage, but they had hardly any way of escaping this situation because they were tied to the land, because they had nowhere else to go, because where would they escape? Because escaping anywhere meant the same fate. As the population grew increasingly, the marginal land was turned over to agriculture with diminishing returns, resulting in lower yields per capita and pushing the population dangerously close to subsistence level. It is not that ever the manorial lords would pay higher wages to the serfs, but because of this surplus labor that was available, the wages, I think there are very intelligent people here who know how feudal system works. Actually, seldom wages were paid. Very seldom a wage was paid in cash or kind. Basically, the system was that the land was given to this serf, this poor serf, to live with his family, and a small piece of land out of which he could make, almost eke out a living. I would not make a living is a very big word to say, eke out a living. And in exchange, this serf had to pay free labor to the farms, to the cultivable land, or other household chores of the manorial lord. That was the basic economic structure of feudal system. So that is what is the economic condition of Europe, when on the other hand Europe is showing certain great leaps in its otherwise high culture, cathedrals being built, the entire Romance culture being slowly and gradually spread with its institution of chivalry and those grand castles and chateaus and the knights, the stories about the knights, the romances and all that. When its high culture was in this sophisticated stage, well, on the land, this was the actual situation where the majority were suffering from only a very minimum subsistence level of survival. So this was the real picture of Europe at the ground. Although when we read as students of English literature, when we read the medieval literature and talk about King Arthur and his Round Table and King Richard Coeur de Lion and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we are not allowed a glimpse into this kind of event that was actually taking place in the background. But then it is not that there are no records. There are several chronicles which also record these events, so they were never mainstream, they were never allowed to be seen by poor academicians like us when we were in college or university. Another thing that was happening in Europe during the same period, this about 12th century, again a very strong parallel to what is happening today, there was a climate change taking place. In 14th century, about 15th century, 1400s, 15th century, there is something called a little ice age. That was actually setting at the onset of this little ice age was beginning in the 12th century. So weather was cooling down. And because of this weather cooling down and the dampness in the European weather, the yield was even becoming less. And this cooling also in a way triggered faster spread of the bacteria which causes plague. So, and we are also in an age of climate change. Although we don't know whether we are cooling or warming, I mean, that's a great debate, but then some kind of climate change was happening even in the 14th century. So that's another parallel with the Black Death tragedy and the modern COVID-19 episode. In 1311, Europe began to experience, I'll read because these are certain facts, so I can't go into. 1311, Europe began to experience a series of crop failures across the continent, and this ultimately resulted in the Great Famine. And this famine reached peak in Northern Europe about 1315-17, so just a generation before the plague had come. The Great Famine killed about 5 to 10% of the population, and which was only to be followed in another 30 years by this almost a 50% wipeout because of the Black Death tragedy. So it is not that pestilence or some kind of death. The macabre, the dance of macabre. We have paintings on the dance of macabre during Middle Ages, and this was not that it was happening only because of the plague. Before that, because of this agrarian crisis, because of the climate change added with the agrarian crisis, basically because of the land becoming a premium value and labor becoming surplus, death was something which was there. It was happening in large numbers. At the same time, remember, when we have this kind of suffering at the ground, when we have people dying of famine, when we have labor force actually having to the rulers of Europe are busy in 100 years war. So the famous 100 years war was actually taking place during the period that the peasants, the serfs, were suffering this kind of a crisis in their life. The ruler, the kings of France and England, they were busy settling a very old score, because we all know from our understanding of the Norman conquest of 1066 that the English ruling family had come from France, because that was a French conquest, and there was I'm not going into the details of the 100 Years' War, except that, well, this is an old conflict that was there, and Edward of England and several kings who ruled France during this time, they thought of settling this score, and well, it took about 100 years and 3 generations of kings to settle the score. But in the process, the already pressurized, already impoverished peasants who were never rich, but even further impoverished, they were also having to pay what is called poll tax. What is poll tax? That's very interesting. Poll tax is the tax you pay to the king on the count of head. So if you have a number of members in the family, say it is 4, and of the 4, 2 are adults and 2 are children, then you pay certain amount per head, literal head of the adult, and a certain amount per head of the children. So the kind of disconnect that was there between the ruling class and the working class, though we can't be talking about in these terms, working class, we are using a modern term to actually talk about a different world order, but it is a fact that this was the kind of gap, emotional, psychological, social gap between the two classes. One, the ruling, and the ones who were toiling on the soil. In times of crisis, the king of England had decided actually to impose a poll tax, which was being, and moreover, this poll tax was not paid by the nobles. The poll tax was not to be paid by the nobles, they were not to be paid by the manorial lords who had surplus money, but this was a tax which was imposed on the poor serfs. The serfs had to pay it. Although the royalty had to pay a very heavy price because of this, because this triggered ultimately the peasant revolt of 1381, which was another very significant event that ultimately brought an end to the supremacy of the noble classes, the nobility in England. Well, these conflicts inhibited trade. Not only that, these conflicts actually tortured the serf because of the poll tax, but also the poll tax was not collected once but twice. On the third attempt, the peasants revolted. And because of this war that was being waged between Europe and France, England and France, and with allies from here and there, so the whole of Europe was almost in war. Because of this war, trade routes were continuously being obstructed. So whatever some kind of compensation could have come from trade with Eastern Europe and Western Europe, or with Northern Europe and the Mediterranean Europe, or with the other side of the Great Wall of the Crusades, the great religious wall that Europe and Arabia drew through the Crusades. Because of these trades being inhibited, being stopped, the condition was even poorer. Another important event that was taking place because of the war and because of the scarcity, because of this reduced production and consumption, was again very Italy were failing. One after the other banks were failing. The northern Italy was, Italy was the heart of the finance of medieval Europe, and it continued to be the heart of the financial hub of Europe for a long time. And that is the reason why Merchant of Venice is Merchant of Venice, not Merchant of London or Merchant of anywhere else. Because if it were not Venice or Naples or Milan, then it would have been very unrealistic. Because when we talk about finance capital, whatever limited finance capital was there during those times, well, the first country that comes to the mind is Italy. And Italy was the heart of the financial system during the time, and all the royalties and all the nobles were actually indebted to some bank or the other in Italy for their requirement of money, which definitely they spent either in their adventures or in extravagance. Northern Italy was the heart of the finance system at this time, and I'm reading because I can't remember the names very specifically. So if I don't name the banks, the point is lost. A small number of very large banks actually had the cash record that was there in their ledgers were less than the actual cash they had in their store. So does this not remind us of what happened in 2008 in America? So basically, this was something which was happening, that the banks in America, they did not show the real assets that they had. I mean, the assets that they projected was not the real assets. It was somehow a fraudulent asset, and because ultimately there was this loan crisis, this debt crisis that the banks faced one after the other. So that is something which was happening there then also in Italy. As in the case of 2008, all available money was loaned out. Oh my God! All available money was loaned out, and they're leaving these banks undercapitalized and very vulnerable. And one of those who took loans from the banks was the English king himself. So let me read a bit. Both these eventualities soon came to pass, triggering cascading failures across the financial system. First, the war broke out between England and France in 1294, continued for about more than 100 years, prompting King Edward I, the King of England, to withdraw huge sums from the bank called Riccardi of Lucca. And if we draw a parallel between the amount that was drawn then with the times that we are living, it was in several $1 billion. And this Riccardi, this bank did not have enough money, but the king forced with his military power, with his influence, to compel the bank to loan whatever assets the bank had to the king. That was what was happening. That was what the English king did to this bank. Not only that, there were also some other banks like Frescobaldi, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and all these banks were facing a similar fate. Each were ruined by these kings, especially the English kings. Most spectacularly, Edward III, when he was asked to pay back the loan, he refused to pay it. And he defaulted, and because of the default, these banks collapsed. So whatever, if we look at the agrarian crisis, there is recession, there is low production, less consumption, wealth is not being created. If you come to wars, well, a large amount of wealth is actually being drained into a absolutely fruitless, unproductive purpose. And then, if you look about the finance system, that also is collapsing because of the other two reasons. Another important thing that happened was the religion. Now, this is something which is very interesting. We know that the church had developed a lot of financial interest and economic interest over a period of time, and that as all churches do, as all established religions do, as all great seats of established religions do, they become in themselves enterprises, and the church itself was an enterprise. The church could not increase its wealth unless and until it colluded and it collaborated with the kings, and that is something which always happens. And more importantly, these churches, the cathedrals, the monasteries, and other ecclesiastical institutions, they also behave like manorial lords. Not only that, the secular vassals of the king got these rights as vassals of the king, in the sense that they got a piece of land from the king on the promise that whenever the king needs military and other services, they will provide. That is the basic system of the vassal system, the king and the vassal system. These manors were very often also granted to these churches, to these cathedrals, and the church was quite embroiled in this entire crisis. The church was a part of it. But more importantly, what happened was a conflict broke out between the Catholic Church and the King of France, Philip IV, who was initially a great defender of the church, and he wanted actually French popes. So ultimately, this conflict resulted in accidental death of killing actually of a pope, and the French king went on appointing French popes one after the other. 3 French popes were appointed, and the seat of the papacy was shifted from Rome to Avignon in France. And all this ultimately came to some kind of a resolution only in 1470. So, if we look at the kind of events, I've only talked about what was happening at the top, but well, if these things are happening at the top, one can realize that the church was not a very dependable organization, and people were gradually losing faith in this institution even before the Black Death took place. So the church was the trust in the church. Now, trust in the church is a very important thing in the medieval age. I mean, say what happens if we lose faith in science today? If we lose faith suddenly, something happens and we lose faith in science. If this happens today, I mean the crisis that we would be in, both if it comes to epistemology, ontology, or even our existential, it would be an existential crisis. I mean, it's a great crisis. I mean, say today something happens, somebody comes and says that, well, whatever beliefs we have in science are all wrong, all false, and so this is to be rejected. Right? The moment this happens in the modern world, there would be not only panic, there would be actually a question about how to explain my existence, because I am habituated to understand, to figure out my life according to the laws as given by physics, chemistry, biology, technology, and all that. Now, science as the authority of knowledge, science as the legitimacy of knowledge, is something which is recent, which is comparatively recent. It is after the Middle Ages. It's one of the pillars of modernity. But before modernity set in, the church was that authority who sanctioned what is knowledge. Church was the legitimacy, the legitimating agency, institution behind knowledge. So losing faith in church is not a very simple event well, we can be choosing to be atheists today. I mean, we can be choosing to be saying that, well, religious has no importance. Today, we are perfectly legitimate in demanding that and somehow justifying it because of science. But then this was something which was not possible in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, the authority who gave sanction, who gave validity to knowledge was the church. And if church is getting challenged, then, well, the entire knowledge system fails. So this was the kind of crisis that happened when church itself came into question. Another reason why church came into question was when this plague was taking place. When this plague was taking place, the church did simply nothing to stop it or to give care. Other than, like, there were some John Ball. I mean, there were some aberrant priests of the parishes who actually sided with the people. But otherwise, the church locked itself. I mean, almost like what we saw today in recent India, where the churches and the temples and the mosques closed themselves to as if the idols sitting inside the temples would be infected with COVID-19. So something similar was happening when the church closed itself to the people with this spread of the Black Death. And well, that was something. And not only that, I mean, faith in God itself was brought into question. Because if God is the Father, then how can the Father tolerate killing of so many people in such a merciless manner in such a short period of time? For no sins of theirs. In fact, what sin could a serf commit? I mean, he did not have enough capacity to actually commit a sin. He was in such a poor state of affairs that a serf could not even dare to commit a sin. So, and he lived a very humble life. Actually, bread and water, very little protein intake. I mean, that also is something which changed with the Black Death. So, very little protein intake. So, with these kind of very sorry state of life, what kind of sin could these serfs commit? And if they had no sins, which they knew they did not, why was God punishing them? So there was definitely some reason to lose faith in God because of this bubonic plague, this black death plague that was spreading all over England and Europe. And this is what is the major background. And now I will just go into a very short discussion of the manorial system. You know that manorial system, medieval Europe operated on this manorial system, and the basic basic theory was that the manorial lord would give this land to this serf, and the serf would eke out a living, and in exchange he would work in the fields and house of the manorial lord. Now, because of this major demographic change that took place in Europe over a very short period of time, land no longer was needed in that amount. Because now, the price of land immediately got reduced because so much of land needed to be cultivated to produce enough food for all the people who were there. And naturally, labor, which had actually, the number of labor, the availability of labor had become scarce. So naturally, the labor was also becoming expensive. The labor that the serfs gave was becoming expensive. So they got some kind of a bargaining power because of the reduced population. That was something which went to the advantage of those serfs who actually lived the pestilence. And soon, the manorial lord also lost interest in getting more and more land cultivated because of the very reason, because what he would do with this extra amount of grain, extra amount of wheat that would come out of these fields. So the fields were being less cultivated, and over that, the manorial lords were losing interest in land because the land was no more that profitable. And the serfs were somehow getting some kind of a bargaining power over the lords to negotiate wage, to negotiate larger land, and also the terms of relationship between the manorial lord and the serf was changing. It was changing from the initial almost a servility to the lord, the vassal king, really the vassal lord relationship. It was changing from there to the tenant farming. That is, tenant farming means the tenant, the serf, the one who tills the land. He takes the land on rent, promising a fixed cash value for the land for a particular period of time, and whatever produce he does on the land is all for him to consume or to sell, to trade, whatever. And because these serfs got that leverage because of the black death, because this land now was theirs, in the sense that whatever produce this land could make, it was all theirs. Now this was an incentive to increase productivity. Definitely, this was because all the produce would be theirs, and that is also the beginning of the rise of the middle class. And it is these people who actually incentivize production, and the production increase, and more importantly, the land now which was extra could now be used to raise livestock. And this livestock again played a very, very important role in reducing the death toll of plague, because now the serfs also could get access to good animal protein, which they earlier did not have. Now, because of this access to ample of animal protein, the kind of tremendous force that this plague had, that also got reduced over a period of time. So this helped the serfs in many ways than one. Not only that, they now got a good bargaining power for their wages, but also they could now take farms on tenancy terms, on rent, and they could produce and keep the produce for themselves and then trade and do whatever with that. And also they could raise livestock, which was helping them to increase their protein intake and thereby giving them some kind of a leverage in fighting this terrible disease. So this is what is a shift in complete modes of production from the feudal system where the serf was locked to the land, and because of the fact that labor was in surplus and the serf did not have any place to go, now the serf, the lower classes, got that leverage to actually have a bargaining power and improve their way of life, their conditions of life. And more importantly, the means of production, of which only a limited part was in the hands of the serfs, and which was the means of production was with the feudal lord. That means of production, the land, as well as the labor that these people, that these serfs were actually investing, now these belong to. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Continue.
So the land which king, that slowly and gradually started to get transferred to the lower classes, and so we have the beginning, the ushering in of a new mode of production, which we initially call agrarian capitalism, which later on triggered industrial revolution, and we have financial capital as we see today. This is what was happening in the villages. In the towns also some changes were taking place. The cities were also undergoing change. In the cities, two things were very importantly happening. One, because of this reduction of manpower, male force in the labor market, a lot of women actually were taking control of the trade or the crafts that their husbands had so long performed. So some amount of female women entrepreneurs were actually could be noticed during the period that is under discussion. And more importantly, the aristocrats could not anymore afford the kind of extravagance, the kind of luxury that they had so long done. So there was some kind of a change that was taking place both in the lives of the aristocrats as well as the common city dwellers. So some kind of, I would not say an equality was being established, but some kind of a bridging of the gap between the stark difference, the stark inequality was slowly and gradually, very immediately, but then definitely better than what it was earlier. Some kind of bridging of the gap between this stark inequality was taking place, and that could not have happened if the Black Death tragedy did not take place. So this is what. When I say this, I should also mark that the aristocrats did not take this whole thing lying down very easily. They wanted to artificially lower down the wages, which they failed because of the market forces. They imposed sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws is something which is there in Europe from ancient times, that there are periods when there are laws passed to prevent people from luxury, extravagance, and every sort of extra spending because of some crisis. Now the sumptuary laws were never made for the aristocrats; it was always imposed on the serfs, on the lower classes. Well, these laws could not take effect because the world order was changing. And the other thing that was happening was, because of the taxation and because of the sumptuary laws and the kind of unrealistic demands made by the aristocrats, the peasants were breaking into the. Well, initially steps were taken to suppress these revolts, But well, when forces of history become such strong, well, one class cannot withstand it for a very long time. So these revolts ultimately succeeded and brought some kind of empowerment to the lower classes. At least the whole feudal world order, where the entire power was concentrated with the nobility, with people who claim the power only because of their bloodline, well, that system changed. So this was the kind of change that could be brought about because well, there were. It is not that there were not many other factors. There were several factors. But then, had this black plague, this black death plague, not taken place, well, maybe that the things would not have been happening in the place as in which it happened. So that is my basic assumption. And now to draw some kind of a comparison, well, since this I've already said that there is no comparison can be done between COVID-19 and Black Death because the scale of COVID-19 is something which is nowhere near even the Spanish flu H1N1 virus, which gripped the world during the 1920s and till the Second World War. Nowhere near. I mean, the number of people who died in H1N1 flu is estimated to be 5 million, which is about a large percentage of the total people who got infected. And compared to that, COVID-19 is a very docile disease. And that is actually why when Amar came and talked to me about the fact that we want to have a discussion on pandemic, I said, why pandemic? I mean, what is there to start thinking about this pandemic? Well, I am a victim of the pandemic in the sense that my wife is also has suffered this disease and she is come up well. Well, every disease has its death toll. Even influenza can cause severe pneumonia and a person can die. Well, that is a challenge that always remains with the medical science: how to treat, how to cure. But then COVID-19, the kind of importance that we have given to COVID-19 is more than what it deserves. At least so far, the records as they are, and we are expecting vaccine to be very soon. To the little amount of fear that we have of the disease will soon disappear. But is there some kind of a, I'm not sure, but then I don't want to make any kind of wild guess. But then I always feel that COVID-19 has been a great opportunity for some. Because COVID-19 was an opportunity to push certain ideas into societies, which could be done very rapidly, which in normal situations would not have been possible. Certain economic agenda could be performed very well, very fast, without consultation, without going through the process of legislation, and which would not have been possible in normal times. Some political ideology could be driven into the people and without much scope for going out on the streets and protesting. So is then COVID-19 will be taken as an opportunity? I mean, that is I'm not giving any kind of comment, but then my only some kind of a just an opinion that I passed. I mean, I don't have any facts to substantiate what I say, but then and therefore it's a wild guess. But then always I have this feeling that well, COVID-19 has always been made to appear more than what it should be, and so this is no time that we should take our time out of the normal course of action, normal day-to-day living, and normal academic and social responsibilities, and lock ourselves into homes, thinking that well, the virus is walking down the street, and anytime I go out, and it will just catch on me with the spike. So, I mean, I'm not someone who subscribes to that view of COVID-19, but then. Yes, when I say this, I'm also saying that, well, this is not a threat. So why should I then talk about other epidemics and what they did and what effects that they brought? But yes, I mean, COVID-19 gives an opportunity to think about what an epidemic, what a time in the pandemic is about, and to reflect that both from our experience, from our exposure to media. Well, that is yet another something which I don't I should least talk about. But then there are also safe and dependable media. So that media, our academic work, our discussions, well, and definitely looking back at history, we can perhaps find parallels in the sense that there have been pandemics and pandemics which would actually bring about changes. So whether if we don't want such upheaval to take place either. I mean, in both ways. If we don't want such upheaval to take place, which would happen even without, whether we should rectify the course that we have taken, if there are mistakes, if there are, that is what history teaches us. If there are mistakes that we have done, well, this is the time that we should rectify. And if we think that, well, this social order is something which is a passe, which can no longer bring about more a developed society, more advanced society, then it's time that we should strike the social order at the right places and see if we can do something to fundamentally change it into a more sympathetic, a more tolerant world order. So that is my submission. Now, if you have any questions, so welcome.
Thank you, Pata sir, for this wonderful lecture. It was like
I mean, this is sorry.
It was like it was like taking us back in time and giving us a picture of a pandemic that happened in some distant land in some distant time, but having like shocking resemblances with the contemporary period we are going through actually. So we literally and metaphorically lost track of time, and hope, and this lecture should have continued a bit more. Like, and for us actually who teach.
You're not audible.
Middle English literature about the students and for us also. It's required to have this kind of perspective and incorporating them in a study of literature. I'll just go first that this pandemic situation may create a rupture in the notion of globalization with much focus on the localized production and economy.
Well, should I answer?
Yeah.
See,
yes,
we are talking in terms of localized production or something, but then does that make a difference? I mean, you see, ultimately, the entire world order is governed from somewhere else, the WTO and the World Bank and IMF and all that. So when we talk about local production, are we meaning going back to Khadi? No, definitely not. We are not going into the Gandhian or Rabindranath's local production. We are talking about simply goods, products made by our national capitalists, the capitalists or the production houses of the nation. Now, these big, the industrialists, whom we call the native capitalists, they are in a bond with the world capital. So whether we are buying something which is made in US or in China or made by some big industrial house within this country, I mean, who belongs to this country, it hardly makes a difference, because after all, we are feeding into the world order, which is the same. So I don't see that the kind of rupture that we are talking about and in various populist slogans. Well, I don't find any kind of and why should I? Because, well, while the time that we are going through pandemic, we saw those expensive fighter jets coming from some part of the world. So will that change? No, it will not. It will not. I mean, world order is the same. We heard that in the defense media reports say that in the defense that India is going to produce its own material in next 4 or 5 years. But then the very next day we are also getting news of gears being exported from somewhere, some other part of the world. So actually, it is not a matter of whether we are going into buying or we are going to consume things made in India or things made in US or things made in China. It's actually we are continuously feeding into that system. The system which is controlled by certain very limited agencies in New York or in Brussels or some other part of the world. Definitely not in India or in our villages where our toiling masses live. If I have answered your question correctly or satisfactory.
Yeah. The second, yes. So can we move on to the second question? I guess that this question is from Dr. Aparna Mukherjee, and the question is in similar lines actually. Can India move to local in post-pandemic era, showing a new economic and literally awakened direction to the world? So we have a kind of a similar kind of question.
I don't know what is local. I mean, this is a new terminology that has come about. But then, by meaning local, are we meaning to go into buying khadi? By meaning local, are we going to mean buying from our neighborhood shops and not going to Reliance Fresh or Spencer's or the more? By being local, do we mean to buy fish from not the grofers and big basket, but from the fish vendors who come to our doorstep? If that is the case, I mean, if nobody is saying that way, I mean, at least the government agencies are not wanting us to be local in that sense. What simply is being talked about when we are saying going local is, well, we have a global outlook and then we buy things which are made in India. Now, things made in India does not mean that it will actually empower our grassroots producers. That is not it. Exploitation will remain whether or not this capital is coming from somewhere in the US or from the houses of the Adanis, Ambanis, builders, Tata, whoever it is. So that is not the question. The question is, well, the person that comes to my mind always is, who could be a more global citizen than Rabindranath? Who could be a more global citizen than Rabindranath? I mean, one who made a university which has its motto as where the world finds one nest, where the whole world is accommodated, irrespective of religion, language, caste, gender, everything. He borrowed freely from every culture, from whichever part of the world we can think of. He extensively traveled, and his travels are for him pilgrimages, because he's going with some kind of a mission to enrich himself when he's going to see the world. But then, if we look at his Shantiniketan, Sriniketan experiment, where do we have some kind of foreign influence? It's not that he did not welcome the world. He did. He learned from the world. But then, that was, if you have to learn from the world and make something local, well, that should be the experiment. Well, that is something which we have forgotten. That is something which we have forgotten. And we are not, when we are saying that, well, we think global and go local, we are not talking about khadi. In fact, a few days back, all those boards that govern the jute production or the khadi and handloom, these were actually abolished by our present government. So it is not that when we are saying that we go local, we are talking about going back to khadi, going back to the Gandhian principles of village economy. We are talking about simply not preferring, we are talking simply about preferring our native capitalists over global capitalists, actually ignoring the fact that these two are linked inevitably. They have a very close natal links. They cannot be separated as such. If I don't know, I mean, if the question had any other meaning, because these webinars are such that we don't have exchanges. I mean, so whether I understood the question correctly, I have always a doubt.
I guess the answer was pretty relevant to the question. So we move on to the next question, and this is from Sneha. And the question is like, sir, apart from the Canterbury Tales, could you suggest a few medieval texts that concentrate or touch upon the epidemic?
Well, there are chronicles, several chronicles. One that comes to my mind immediately is Giovanni Sarcambi. I mean, Sarcambi's chronicles are there. I mean, so we could be reading the chronicles for the detailed description of the Canterbury Tales has very passing reference. So even Decameron is so. But then if we have to have very what you call historical record of there are many. Coming to my mind right now is Giovanni Sarcambi, but I could actually name many more, where you have the chronicles of the Middle Ages, and but these chronicles are, I think, the better historical records than the literary records, because literary records, well, they do literary records definitely are very important sources of history, but then if we have some chronicles, well, definitely, I mean, they are more factual, supposedly, and they are more, I think, the experiential than literature. Literature has always that scope of imaginative intervention, which I'm not saying that chronicles cannot have imaginative intervention. They can always have. That is my entire project. History can be wrong at many times, but then they could be treated as far as we understand, better sources of history.
Okay. So with this, probably before sir we end, there was one query that came to my mind while listening to your lecture was one thing that differentiates this pandemic from the other pandemics is probably the role of media, and probably when how this role of media will impact our understanding of the pandemic, or say our 30 years down the line world's understanding of this pandemic.
I mean, this is a great question. I mean, I really don't know. But then one thing that can be said is, world over, it's not only happening in India, but world over, a sizable section of the media is siding with the government, with the powers that be, with the government in power. So their basic intention is to keep us at dark from the real issues that are coming out of the pandemic. For example, only on 29 July, as academicians will be debating about this and about nothing else for coming 2-3 months. That is the National Education Policy 2020, and how it is going to affect our personal career as well as education scenario as a whole, because it has a far-reaching implication if it is carried out in total. I mean, it is going actually to change the Indian education, to my understanding, in a wrong direction. It will make education exclusive. It is going to make education very, very costly, unaffordable, and it would be commercialized, all that. But then, where is the discussion in media?
And probably to put it under surveillance also, which is very dangerous.
Surveillance, you see, surveillance, it is not that this is something new, because with technology is something which we can't avoid. I mean, the relationship with technology is something which is always two-pronged. It is both taking advantage, and technology is always also in many ways a limitation. But as we know that technology, for example, this discussion would not have happened without technology. So technology is in a way a boon. But then there's a very age-old question, I mean, whether technology is a boon or a curse. So technology at the same time is helping us to keep a surveillance on us. But then surveillance was always there. It's not that surveillance is something that one who has this hankering for power, one who wants to retain power. I'm not talking about a single individual or a single political party or something. I mean, the class, the ruling class as a whole, in whichever social order we think of, where power that we did not want to have a very tight surveillance on its citizens. So as technology has advanced, the methods and effectiveness of the surveillance surveillance was always there. Surveillance is something which we can't avoid. And well, the result of surveillance is the most vulnerable classes. The most vulnerable classes succumb to it first. The middle classes, to which you and I belong. We are those who will be succumbing to it because we have too much at a stake, so we can't be allowing ourselves to be in this surveillance, and therefore we will be silencing ourselves. Our dissent, our resentment will be somehow washed away. That is something which we usually do in order to, because a lot of our issues are at stake. But then surveillance is something which can never stop the real agents of history, who are the people who are toiling in the fields. Surveillance has never been effective to stop them, because since they have very little to gain from the system as it runs, they can be ready for larger sacrifices than we, the great beneficiaries of this world order, the selfish beneficiaries. We are people who actually fear to go into some kind of a resentment, because we have a fear to lose a lot. But then the larger part of the society, well, since it doesn't gain much from this social order, they don't have any fear of losing as well. If any kind of, I don't know, death is always better than hunger.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. We like to have this discussion to continue, but we have some time constraint. So thank you for your patience and providing us with your valuable time. Thank you, both the resource persons and all the participants. So with this, we come to the end of our second technical session. We'd end this session with a program day with a vote of thanks. I will request Dr. Sudipto Shah, IQAC Coordinator and Assistant Professor, Department of Bengali, Nagar College, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Sudipto.
Thank you, Ojit. At least, first day, first session will come to the end. Trauma of pandemic and cultural discourse, entitled the webinar. I express my special gratitude to Honorable Principal, Nagar College organizers, my esteemed Abhijit Bhattacharya, Anwar Hossain, and other distinguished participants, and Dr. Manik Vishwas for his tirelessly effort to achieve this performance. And I also express my deepest gratitude to Dr. Mouma Bhumi, Associate Professor, Zero College, Dr. Partha Gangopadhyay, Director, Institute of English, Calcutta. I think the discussion is very important in our new normal. Thank you everybody. We shall meet tomorrow in the same time. Organizers will send the link of YouTube for the second day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now the session is over for today.